Every year, well-meaning homeowners harm or even kill their trees that they were trying to help, and it usually comes down to one mistake. That mistake is often pruning without a goal. If you start pruning without a goal, how do you know what time of year you should prune? What branches to cut? And do you even know the cost of every cut? Remember this, you can't put it back on. And if you're ever unsure, stop. A single consultation with a certified arborist costs far less than a damaged or dying tree. Why are you pruning? What is the goal? In this video, I'm going to cover the main reasons for pruning, the best times to prune, the main targets for what to remove, and show you examples of everything I talk about. So that's the why, the when, and the what. Then I'll briefly cover how to prune. I've covered that before in other videos, and I'm going to go into a lot more detail on how to prune in a follow-up video about pruning my plum trees. Subscribe so you don't miss that. But I will touch on it briefly here to make this video a more complete resource. This is literally a 5-credit college course wrapped into a few minutes, so get your notebooks and pencils ready. The usual goals. Why are you pruning? Again, this is the most important thing to identify before you ever reach for a saw. So some reasons you might prune, some goals you might have are cleaning, removal of dead, dying, diseased, weakly attached, and low vigor branches from the crown of a tree. Raising, removal of lower branches to provide clearance for something, usually buildings, vehicles, pedestrians, or vistas. Or maybe so you can mow your lawn without hitting your head. Whatever. Reduction. Reducing the size of a tree. Usually for utility line clearance. Sometimes it's done because a homeowner decides the tree is just too big. But honestly, if that's the case, you might want to consider removal and planting a tree that's more appropriately sized. Reducing density. Thinning is sometimes performed to increase light or air penetration for aesthetic reasons or to promote interior foliage development. Maximizing flowers or fruit. Pruning at the right time removes competing vegetative growth and redirects the tree's energy into reproductive output. For fruit trees, this often means thinning crowded branches to improve light penetration and air circulation around developing fruit. This one is complex and honestly, it's confusing. It could be a whole video on its own. Let me know in the comments if you'd like another video on timed pruning to maximize flowers or fruits, but the fundamental rule is prune after the plant has done what you want it to do. When to prune? When the saw is sharp. For most light, routine pruning, especially removing dead, dying, or deformed limbs, pruning can be done at any time of the year and likely should be done as soon as possible. Other considerations? Growth is maximized and wound closures expedited if pruning takes place before the spring growth flush. Heavy pruning of live tissue during or just after spring growth should be avoided, especially on weak trees. Tree diseases can be spread when pruning because wounds provide access to disease-causing agents, and pruning tools can also vector pathogens. Susceptible trees should not be pruned during active transmission periods. For example, oak wilt. Oaks shouldn't be pruned during spring and early summer when the fungal pathogen spreads most aggressively through sap beetle activity. Local extension offices or certified arborists can advise on region-specific disease windows. So if you want to know more about your specific situation with your trees and your climate, check with a certified arborist or your Master Gardener Extension office. If you're unsure about when to prune, contact a local certified arborist. And I can't stress this enough, make sure they are certified. Any Joe can pick up a saw and say he can prune a tree, but are they a certified arborist? Remember, you can't put it back on. The many D's, a mnemonic list of what to remove. This is interesting. It's different from what I learned when I was in college, and I'll say more about that at the end of this segment. I'm going to go through them, then I'm going to say what they all mean and show examples. They are dead, dying, diseased, disorderly or deranged, defective, disfigured, declining, dangerous. Different lists have different words on them, and there is no standardized list of Ds. Now let's go through them one by one and distinguish what each means. Then I'm going to talk about what I learned and how I learned it. On all lists, the first 3 Ds are all in agreement: dead, dying, and diseased. Then it gets interesting. There are several more depending on the source you're looking at. Disorderly or deranged means undesirable directions or interfering with the plant's overall structure. This includes crossing and rubbing. defective, structurally weak or poor form, narrow crotch angles, excessively long and spindly, disfigured, cosmetic correction of undesirable form, declining, trees in overall poor health, which is different from dying, which refers to the individual branch, not the whole tree, and dangerous, aka hazard pruning. These are limbs or entire trees that pose a safety risk to people or property. Keep in mind that every cut has the potential to change the tree forever. You can't put it back on. Removal of live growth affects the tree's ability to photosynthesize and produce its food. Large limb removal can impact form and geometry, which can affect stability as well as aesthetics. Inconsiderate removal of branches can leave the tree susceptible to decline. A tree that took 30 years to grow can be damaged beyond recovery by 30 minutes of bad pruning. Quick side note on where these Ds came from and how they differ from what I was taught. So I'm going to go down a couple of rabbit holes here. Bear with me. When I was in college, I was taught a prioritized list of what to prune: dead, dying, disease, crossing or rubbing, then aesthetic. It was simple and easy enough to remember. I graduated in 2010 and I only just heard about the Ds within the last year, sometime in 2025, I think. Maybe even this year, 2026. I wondered where it came from. Like, did somebody notice that the first 3 words started with D and they just ran with it? Is there more to this story? So I asked Claude, which another slight rabbit hole. I will no longer use ChatGPT since they quite literally just sold their soul to the devil. And so have a bunch of other AI companies. As of this recording, I think there are 6 or 7 that have agreed to use their technology for war purposes, so I won't use them anymore. Anthropic is the one that will not allow their tech to be used in military operations. So I'm now using their platform, Claude. I've even found it to be better, actually. It just answers my query completely without asking follow-up questions to clickbait me into another query. Okay, end of rabbit hole. Thank you. Claude spent a minute reading the internet and said that the paper trail on this is thin. No one really knows where it came from, and that my assumption was probably correct, that someone noticed the first 3 pruning targets started with D and they just ran with it. They started choosing words that started with D to make the mnemonic work. The search did dig up some interesting history, but I won't get into that here. I'll copy it into a comment below. Feel free to read and start discussing it there. Honestly, I think it might be harder to remember because there's little consistency between the different sources, and the D words aren't as clear as just saying what the problem is actually called. Now that you know why, when, and what, let's talk briefly about how. And again, I'll go into much greater detail in the how, like the practical of this, in my next video. Nearly every woody tree has what's called a branch bark ridge and a branch bark collar at every single joint. So if you imagine that my arm is the trunk of the tree and my thumb is a lateral branch, where my knuckle is, where it gets wide, is a lot like the branch bark collar. It wraps all the way around the lateral branch, and that's where you need to cut. The branch bark ridge is a little bump of bark that happens between the 2 branches, and that's where the wood actually knits itself together and makes a strong connection between the lateral branch and the trunk. The collar is where cellular division happens. This is where callus is created. Callus is the tissue that seals in a wound and prevents further damage like rot or insect invasion or pathogens. Now, it takes a long time for callus to grow over a large cut. So it's not like just slapping a Band-Aid on the tree and it's going to stop the invasion of those things, but it does eventually grow into place and protect the tree from further damage. I will also make a quick segue here to talk about tree Band-Aids and these other products that used to be applied to tree wounds. We don't do that anymore. The benefits of those have been completely debunked. The tree is better off on its own, using the things that it has evolved to use for millennia. Don't reinvent the wheel. The trees are fine. Cut them correctly, and the tree will seal its wound just fine. So the branch bark collar is where you need to ultimately make your cut. But if you have a very heavy lateral branch and you try to cut it correctly on your first go, it's very likely that the weight is going to break, and then the bark is going to strip, and it's going to create a very large wound that is not desirable at all. The tree will never be able to seal it in. Quick note of distinct semantics: trees do not heal, they seal. Trees can never heal wounds. Like if we get a cut, we get a scab, and then the skin heals and we move on, life goes on. It's like nothing ever happened. Trees don't get to do that. What they do is they seal their wounds. They compartmentalize their wounds. So they try to section it off to where if there's a wound, let's just keep it here and not let it spread. So that's what callus does. And trees will also segment their wood if there's a wound like on the main trunk. They'll segment it off so that the damage from that wound doesn't spread. So the solution to that, if you have a very heavy lateral branch that you need to take off, is called a 3-point cut. So the first cut goes underneath. You go out from the branch bark collar and you do an uppercut. You cut from the bottom up until your saw gets pinched, and actually stop before your saw gets pinched. But the point is that you want to break that bark so that when the branch breaks, it doesn't strip the bark all the way down the tree. So your second cut, you go farther away than your first cut, and you make a downward cut. What this does is it creates a weak point that will cause the branch to break off, and that's the point. But the bark won't strip because you've already created an end to where the bark is. So you break off the branch, and then you go back and you do your third cut, which is the correct one, the one right on the branch bark collar. That's a 3-point cut, and it's one of the most common techniques that I use during pruning more often than anything else, aside from just cutting on the collar. So that's for a normal cut where you're cutting a lateral off of a larger branch. What if it's the larger branch that actually needs to be cut? That's called a heading back cut. There's a few caveats on these. Again, with my arm, okay? If I wanted to head this branch back to this lateral, it wouldn't be a good idea because this lateral is too narrow. You should always have a lateral that's at least a quarter, if not a third is better, the ratio of size of the branch you're cutting. What that means is if you're cutting a big fat branch down to a spindly little shoot, it's not going to survive. It's not going to do well. You're actually going to kill the rest of the branch all the way back down because there won't be enough photosynthetic material on this little spindly branch to support this large branch. But for the sake of demonstration, let's pretend that my thumb was actually a sizable ratio to the rest of my hand. I want to cut this because whatever's going on up here is damaged or diseased or dying, okay? I would come back to the lateral where I want to cut, just a little bit up so I don't cut into the collar, and then cut at a diagonal away from this lateral. Kind of like when you cut a rose. This is called a heading back cut because you're bringing down the head. You're bringing back the head. You're heading it back. This is usually used, like I said, if the terminal branch has a problem, like it's dying or dead or diseased or something and needs to be brought down to remove the disease from a tree so that it doesn't spread further. It can also be used for size reduction or shaping the tree. So what happens if you cut off that end of the branch, that's where the apical meristem is. The apical meristem is the cell responsible for all of the growth along that branch. And if you cut that out, it actually encourages more lateral growth. So if you want your tree to be less long and more bushy, you can take off the top a little bit and encourage more lateral growth. Now, when I say take off the top, I don't mean topping. That's not it. No professional arborist will ever top a tree. They know better. Topping is an internodal cut. There is no lateral. It's just a cut somewhere on the branch. We don't do that. There always has to be a lateral next to where your cut is. Topping causes irreparable damage to trees. They cannot come back from it. What will end up happening is the trees will end up sending up water sprouts, which are adventitious growth that use a lot of energy because it's trying to recover from this trauma of just being destroyed. Those branches, the water sprouts, are often weakly attached, but they're likely to fall. They use as much or more energy than they provide, and it'll end up making the tree sicker over time. So whatever you do, do not top your trees. Now, using that bit of information, we'll segue into another pruning technique called pollarding. I hate pollarding, honestly, but some people like it, and it is an accepted type of pruning. It was created in Europe, where most of our pruning strategies were developed over centuries. Pollarding is where you make one topping cut of a branch that's about an inch wide or less, never a giant trunk, not a big sizable branch. A small branch, maybe an inch wide, like this, okay? You make one internodal topping cut. That spurs water sprouts. Then, every year, forever, until the tree dies, you have to go in and manually remove every single one of those water sprouts. And what it does is it creates these knobs on the end of the branches. It kind of looks like the Whomping Willow from Harry Potter. You get big branches with knobs on the end. That's an accepted form of pruning called pollarding, and it does start with topping cuts. But that's not topping. Don't top your trees. There's another form of pruning that's generally considered very incorrect, so I'm going to mention it real quick. That's called lion's tailing. What lion's tailing is when you have a lateral branch with a whole bunch of tertiary branches, and you take off all those tertiary branches, so you just have a long stick with a poof at the end, like a lion's tail. Don't do that. It just looks stupid, for one thing, and it's not really great for the health of the tree because the tree made these laterals and tertiary branches for a reason. It actually needs them to support its life. So unless the branches are dead, don't take those off. For more on how to prune, stand by for my next pruning video where I will show you everything I did to prune these plum trees. If you're unsure about when to prune, contact a local certified arborist. And remember, once again, you can't put it back on. A tree that took 30 years to grow can be damaged beyond recovery by 30 minutes of bad pruning. So if you're unsure about why, when, or how to prune, contact a local certified arborist. Subscribe and stay tuned for more gardening videos, including the occasional pruning video. Thanks again for watching, everybody. I hope this was extremely valuable to you and that you learned something. If you did, make sure to tell me by hitting the like button down below. If you have any questions or thoughts, leave them in the comments down below. I still respond to every single one of my comments, so make sure to leave your questions below. It helps other people as well who might have the same question. And if you have not already subscribed, please do that so you get future gardening content in your video feed every week. Thanks again for watching, guys. I'll see you in the garden.